So let's take it back to Ronald Reagan for a minute to kind of explain how the last couple of our presidents were influenced by him. And they were, believe me. So Ronald Reagan had initiated something called the Reagan Revolution. Now, he wasn't violently overthrowing any governments or trying to kick anybody out of office. It was more of a revolution in political style. See, the presidents of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s kind of were elected on instituting government programs and such as that. Um, but Ronald Reagan ushered in an idea of conservative politics, and conservative politics to Reagan was a good military, strong economy, low taxes, and government out of your lives. And that sounded really good to a lot of people in the 80s. So after Ronald Reagan's term ended in 88, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, got elected president because people liked his ideas so much they wanted to keep Ronald Reagan's impact going. And then we're going to see large Republican sweeps of congressional elections and state houses in the 1990s. The country was becoming all Republican, all right, in order to get business going and increase the military. And after a stint with Democratic President William Clinton, we get George W. Bush. And George W. Bush is the son of H.W. Bush. So, how is George W. Bush going to keep on Ronald Reagan's influence? In 2001, the World Trade Centers in New York City were rammed into by two different airplanes and they collapsed. And this led to the War on Terror. That attack had been linked back to a terrorist group called Al Qaeda. Now, George W. Bush, kind of in the spirit of containment of communism, sent troops overseas to try to locate Osama bin Laden and upend any regimes that were supporting terrorism. So he's keeping on the policy of having a strong military. So other influences George W. Bush has, he promoted policies on the economy, healthcare, and education, and Social Security reform. Social Security reform was seen as Social Security had gotten too big and out of control, and too many people were living off of it. So he wanted to make it a little bit more, let's say, hard to live off Social Security. It's not quite the right term, but it works here. He's going to sign into law broad tax cuts, promoting that Reagan economy. The Patriot Act, which after 9/11 was basically an act that legalized spying on American citizens. Need to have military intelligence, and the No Child Left Behind Act, which led to a standardization in education and also a lot of standardized testing. All right, he's trying to keep everything going. Now, by the end of his term, by 2008, there was a crisis going on in the American economy. For years, people had been getting loans for their homes, and the big banks who offered the mortgages for the homes were offering mortgages to everybody. Now, the problem here is that just because you can get a mortgage doesn't mean you should. A lot of people start defaulting on their mortgage, which means they're not making payments or can't make payments. So once these people can't pay the banks start running out of money. Does this sound familiar? Sounds like the Great Depression a little bit. Okay, the banks start running out of money. So George W. Bush had to do something, because if these big banks went under, it was going to be Great Depression 2.0. So by 2008, towards the end of his term, he got massive financial assistance to all banks passed by Congress. We call these today the bailouts. Now, how would the American economy have suffered if the banks were allowed to go under because they gave bad loans to people? It's hard to say. But the banks did have to pay back the money they got once they were stable again. George W. Bush saw this potential collapse as calamitous for the government and wanted to make sure it didn't happen. Now, if George W. Bush was an extension of Reagan era kind of policy, the election of Barack Obama, you could say, is kind of counter to that. George W. Bush, by the end of his term, was not a super popular president. So now, 2009, Barack Obama gets elected, and he is still dealing with the economic fallout of the bailouts of the banks and people losing money on mortgages. So he signs into law economic legislation to end something called the Great Recession. The recession being the slowdown in the economy caused by the big banks who were allowing people to default on their mortgages. So in order to get people spending money, because remember, an economy can't run if people don't spend money, Mr. Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 into law. And this was kind of how it sounds. This was everybody in America got a chunk of money. Straight up, no strings attached, just go spend it. Now, a lot of people did go spend it. So with this policy, Obama kind of ushers in a reemergence of the government taking care of people. Gets tax relief. They fix unemployment insurance, and they create jobs, and the government spends money on people's lives to improve them. Now, something Obama's going to try for, and it's going to be a giant fight because no one wants to support him on it. He's going to call for Congress to pass legislation to reform healthcare in the United States. It used to be that insurance didn't have to pay for stuff if you had a pre-existing condition. So if you had diabetes and got sick, the insurance companies could say, hey, you have an existing condition that's going to make you more susceptible to illness. We're not going to pay out for it. Also, lots of young people were uninsured because they couldn't find work right away that could get them insured. President Obama wanted to have a government-sponsored healthcare system so that if you didn't have a job, you could still have health insurance and keep alive. And this is pretty significant because we're shifting away here from the conservative politics influenced by Ronald Reagan to kind of more post-Great Depression era politics that were ushered in by Franklin Roosevelt.